Primeiramente, eu gostaria de perguntar ao senhor quais condições o levaram a passar por essa experiência de quase morte.
Well, it turns out that, my illness developed seemingly out of the blue. We never found a cause for it, and it was very sudden in onset, beginning about 4:30 in the morning on November 10th of 2008, when I woke up with severe back pain and then noticed a really horrific headache. And soon thereafter, I was having grand mal seizures and then dipping deep into coma where I stayed for the next 7 days. My doctors were very astute and realized very quickly that I might have meningitis. And when they did the lumbar puncture and it returned from microbiology a report of gram-negative bacterial meningitis, they knew from my rapid descent into coma over just 3.5 hours that I was already down to about a 10% chance of survival in the emergency room. And that only got worse during the week. On the second day, they found out that it was E. coli. If you do a medical literature search, you'll find that E. coli meningitis in adults is extremely rare. It almost always happens in newborns. So my doctors had that big challenge that they had such a rare illness that was facing them and attacking me. And during the week, on 3 powerful antibiotics, on a ventilator in a medical ICU, I really didn't show many promising signs of turning around at all. So by the 7th day of my coma, my doctors estimated I was down to a 2% chance of survival. But unfortunately for my family, they said if I was that 2% survivor, that would not result in any return of consciousness because I was so ill with a devastating illness that it kept me in coma for a week. And that's not the kind of situation that allows for someone to recover. And that's when they recommended stopping the antibiotics. But of course, it was a few hours later I started coming back to this world. But important to point out for your listeners that when I did so, my brain was absolutely wrecked. I had no words or language. I had no memories of Eben Alexander's life before coma. In fact, I didn't even recognize my mother, my sons, my sisters at the bedside. My brain was really devastated. All I knew was where I had just been, this extraordinary odyssey, a spiritual journey to realms far more real than this one. The journey that I describe in Proof of Heaven, that modern neuroscience would very proudly tell you could not have happened at all, given the facts my doctors had about the destruction of my neocortex, the human part of the brain. And that's where my disease was really such a gift. Because such bacterial meningitis with its devastation of all 8 lobes of my neocortex should have destroyed all but the most rudimentary of conscious experience. And yet what I noted instead was this extreme expansion of conscious awareness far beyond anything I'd ever experienced before. It, to me, was a very clear indicator that we are conscious in spite of our brain. And in fact, what much of my research has come to reveal, which happens to coincide with much of the scientific work on the nature of consciousness and the relationship of brain and mind, is we should look more at the brain as a reducing valve or filter that limits our consciousness and restricts it to this apparent here now and this kind of sense of selfhood. And this is really where a lot of modern consciousness studies are going, to look at consciousness as primordial or fundamental, not something derived from the physical matter of the brain, because we are far more than just a physical incarnation, birth to death, that modern materialist neuroscience would tell you does not even have free will. I would tell you that the exact opposite is true, and it really has to do with broadening our understanding of mind and of consciousness and realizing that the material world is only the tip of the iceberg in terms of what exists, and that we as sentient conscious beings have the power to really explore and come to understand those realms far more through this broadening of our understanding of brain, mind, and consciousness.
Bom, doutor Eben, antes de entrarmos nos detalhes da sua experiência de quase morte, gostaria que o senhor nos explicasse o que essa doença faz com o neocórtex, essa região do cérebro que foi afetada pela sua meningite bacteriana.
Well, what my illness did, according to what my doctors could glean about my neurologic exam, is first of all, the Glasgow Coma Scale is kind of a general measure of how alert one is or how comatose one is. And that scale generally goes from 3 for a corpse or somebody in very deep coma, all the way up to 15 for someone who is awake and alert. Now, any score below 9 is deep coma, and my scores during my entire illness were between 5 and 7. So I was extremely ill from this. And my doctors knew from my neurologic exams and from my scans, which showed that all 8 lobes of my brain were affected, that all the way at the very deepest level of the neocortex, I had a lot of swelling all through my entire brain. So no part of my brain escaped this illness, and that was important information in the months and years since my coma in trying to make sense of this, because it showed very clearly that if you want to assume that the neocortex is creating consciousness, mine was far too heavily damaged to have created anything. And one of the beneficial features of my journey has to do with the fact that there were time anchors that occurred that kind of linked my journey to events occurring in this world, in this earth time, and that those events show very clearly that the vast majority of my coma journey occurred between days 1 and 5 of my coma, when the medical evidence is very clear that I was in deep coma that whole time. There was no way for my brain, either before or after coma, to have contributed based on all the evidence we have.
Bom, Dr. Eben, o senhor teve caso muito raro de meningite bacteriana, ficou 7 dias em coma. Para onde o senhor foi e o que o senhor viu?
Well, it all started in a primitive, coarse, unresponsive realm that I label the earthworm's eye view, that I used to think was the best consciousness that my physical brain could muster while it was soaking in pus and the neocortex being devastated. But I've since come to realize that I believe that very region is commonly encountered in the Tibetan Book of the Dead. It's basically called the Bardo. It's kind of a netherworld between here and those higher spiritual realms. But I was rescued from that by a slowly spinning white light that served as a portal up into a rich, ultra-real valley, what I called in my writings the Gateway Valley. The important thing to point out about that is, even though it had a lot of Earth-like features, I was a speck of awareness on a butterfly wing. There were sparkling waterfalls into crystal blue pools, and there were thousands of beings dancing below me that in my early writings I referred to as souls dancing between lives. And all of the joy and festivities that I was witnessing there were being fueled because up above were these swooping orbs, golden orbs, leaving sparkling golden trails against the blue-black velvety sky. And I call these orbs angelic choirs. And they were emanating chants and anthems and hymns that would just thunder through my awareness. And in that Gateway Valley, I met my kind of guardian angel on this journey. Important to point out that valley, which is where we reunite with our higher soul and with souls of departed loved ones, where I met this beautiful guardian angel and where I learned so much of my journey, is not the end point of the journey, of course. It's a kind of a stepping stone between the lower material realms and the lower spiritual realms and higher ascendants. Because what I ended up seeing there, I think, was a universal message for my journey, and that's the central message of Proof of Heaven, that you have nothing to fear, that you're deeply cherished and cared for and will be taken care of. And that you can trust that the universe will provide this for us. But it turns out that those angelic choirs above provided yet another musical portal to higher and higher levels. And I remember seeing all of space and time of the material realm collapsing down, and even what I call deep time, which is an ordering of events of our higher souls and their ascendance towards oneness with the divine. That deep time realm also collapsing down, and I ascended through all that, through yet another portal, all the way out to the oneness of the core. The core is very far from any kind of human language or explanation. It is the true oneness of infinity, eternity. The entire higher dimensional multiverse was collapsed down as this complex overseer as part of the lessons taught in that core realm. But in that realm, it's so difficult to put it in any kind of human language because it's so foreign to anything we'd ever experienced in this universe, because of that oneness with the divine, with that infinite power of love. And in that core realm, I remember sensing that I was to be taught many things. And of course, the lessons go far beyond any kind of linguistic description or narrative. So much of our learning and knowing in those realms, even in that gateway realm, is accomplished not through seeing with the eyes and hearing through the ears, but we become other beings. Just as you often heard if you talk to many near-death experiencers about life reviews, then that's why the life review is so powerful as a teaching tool. And if we've been busy handing out pain and suffering to others or been greedy and selfish, that comes back to us in that life review. Because there, in the beauty of the light and love of that divine source, of that God force that so many near-death experiencers have talked about in that realm, we end up being our own kind of judge. We're not judged by some higher power, but really by our higher soul and in our soul group, but against this backdrop of pure love. And that's where we come to see the error of ways of any of our actions that were painful or causing suffering to others, because we have to feel that. And that's where we come to realize the deepest lesson of our soul journey, which is that the best way to choose actions and choices, make choices in our lives, is to show love, unconditional love, compassion, kindness, forgiveness, and mercy to all fellow beings, which I think is what the world of near-death experiencers tells us so clearly, because that's the world we enter when we leave this world. And that's where it becomes so glaringly apparent that the lessons of the prophets are to be lived in our lives here. That this is really all about sharing that love and compassion with others and making those choices in our life. And this is why I think it's so important, the lesson that millions of near-death experiencers have brought back to this world is a lesson that is not new to this world, but one that modern consciousness studies, and especially the scientific study of NDEs, points out we should all take very much to heart, is that living our lives as conduits for that love, recovering love for self, and love for others. The best way to manifest that love for self as the sacred, divine, eternal beings that we are, is to serve as a conduit for that love in all of our choices and decisions in living our lives here on earth. But important to point out, the content of the NDE is not dependent on your prior beliefs. The content can change your prior beliefs radically. Just as I had grown up in a Methodist church in North Carolina and had a certain set of religious beliefs, I had spent 8 years before my coma very agnostic. All that is explained in Proof of Heaven, where I gave up on any faith in a loving personal God or power of prayer for 8 years before my coma. But then my coma, of course, was the corrective for that, because my near-death experience showed me very clearly the absolute reality of a loving personal God, and that we are all part of that one mind, of that loving mind of that God, and that is the source of our very conscious awareness.